đã nhận tiêu đề câu chuyện. You will sit alone tonight, Miss Evelyn, because even pity has limits when a woman has nothing left to offer. The words fell across the ballroom before the first dance had even ended. Lady Corisande Valancrest had not raised her voice. She had not needed to. The room had already learned to listen when she spoke. The chandeliers above the polished floor burned brightly. The musicians had just lowered their instruments, and dozens of guests in silk, velvet, and pearl-trimmed gowns had turned toward the young woman standing beside the wall. Evelyn Ashcombe felt every eye settle upon her. She had known that the evening would be difficult. She had known that after 3 seasons of invitations arriving less frequently and conversations growing shorter, the people of the county had begun to decide what her future would look like. But she had not expected Lady Corisande to make the judgment so openly. A few gentlemen looked away with discomfort. A few ladies covered their smiles behind their fans. One elderly guest gave a quiet laugh that was quickly followed by another. Evelyn lowered her gaze, not because she accepted the cruelty, but because she refused to give them the satisfaction of seeing how deeply the words had struck. Lady Corisande stepped closer, holding a small silver card between 2 gloved fingers. Your name was placed on the list out of respect for your father, she continued. But respect is not the same as belonging. The ballroom became still. Evelyn knew the card in Lady Corisande's hand. It was the invitation that had once arrived each winter with warmth and expectation. Now it was being displayed like evidence against her. Lady Corisande smiled faintly. Perhaps it is time you stopped pretending these rooms still welcome you. The laughter that followed was soft. That was what hurt most. Not a shout, not an insult screamed in anger. A quiet agreement from people who believed they were entitled to decide another person's worth. Evelyn's fingers tightened around her gloves. She looked across the room and found her father, the Earl of Ashcombe, standing near the fireplace. He saw what was happening. He heard every word. Yet he remained silent. That silence was heavier than Lady Corisande's cruelty. Evelyn had spent years believing that one day her father would finally see what was happening inside Valancrest. She had believed that when faced with the truth, he would choose his daughter over convenience. But that night, beneath the golden light of the chandeliers, she understood something painful. A person could stand in the same room as someone they loved and still leave them completely alone. She turned toward the doorway. The guests expected tears. They expected a broken young woman rushing away. Instead, Evelyn walked calmly. But before she reached the door, Lady Corisande looked toward the guests and said the words that would later become the beginning of her own downfall. Some people are born to inherit houses. Others are only remembered because they once entered them. The room laughed again. They did not know that hidden beneath Valancrest's old walls was a truth that would one day shake the entire family. Before we return to the beginning of Evelyn Ashcombe's story, tell us where you are listening from tonight. If you enjoy stories of courage, injustice, and forgotten voices finding their way back to dignity, please subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you never miss a new tale. Your support helps keep these stories alive and allows more journeys of resilience and justice to reach those who need them. And to understand why Evelyn stood alone in that ballroom, we must return to the years before the laughter began. Evelyn Ashcombe had not always been a woman people ignored. She had been born the only daughter of Earl Edmund Ashcombe, owner of the old Ashcombe estate that had stood among the cold hills of the English countryside for generations. The house was not the largest in the county, nor was it the richest, but its name carried respect. Her mother, Lady Marianne, had been the warmth inside those stone walls. She had taught Evelyn that gentleness was not weakness. She had taught her that a person's value was not measured by a title, a marriage, or the amount of land written in their name. But when Marianne died, the balance of the household changed. Evelyn was 16 when the funeral carriage left Ashcombe. The house that had once felt alive became a place of careful footsteps and lowered voices. A year later, Earl Edmund married Lady Corisande. The marriage had seemed practical. Corisande came from an old family with valuable connections. She understood society. She understood reputation. She understood the rules that governed every conversation among the upper classes. What she did not understand was affection. From the first months of her arrival, She saw Evelyn not as a daughter needing guidance, but as a problem waiting to be solved. A young woman without a brother. A young woman who could inherit certain protections through her father's affection. A young woman who represented a future Corisande could not fully control. The new Countess of Ashcombe had always believed that power belonged to those who held the information. She began slowly. First came the small changes. Letters from distant relatives stopped arriving. Invitations meant for Evelyn were delayed until the events had passed. A solicitor's message about Evelyn's late mother's personal belongings somehow disappeared before reaching her hands. Nothing was dramatic enough to accuse anyone. That was Corisande's greatest skill. She never pushed the door open. She simply made sure Evelyn no longer had the key. Evelyn tried to remain patient. She helped manage household accounts. She visited tenants on the estate. She learned the names of families who had worked Ashcombe land for decades. While others saw her as a quiet young woman with no future, she saw the estate differently. She noticed things. The same suppliers charging different amounts. The same repairs appearing twice in the ledgers. The same sums leaving the household without clear explanations. She did not yet understand what it meant. She only knew something was wrong. Her first real warning came one winter evening. Rain struck the windows of Ashcombe Manor. The corridors were cold, and the servants moved quickly to avoid the sharp voices coming from the library. The library door was usually locked. Evelyn had never been invited inside. That night, while passing through the hallway, she saw the door slightly open. A candle burned inside. She heard Lady Corisande speaking. Evelyn stopped, not because she wished to listen, because she heard her own name. The Countess's voice was calm. "The girl is becoming too observant," a man answered. Evelyn recognized the voice of Mr. Harcourt, the family solicitor. Then she heard something that made her heart slow. If the arrangements are completed, she will have no reason to question anything. There was a pause. And then Corisande said, "Once the estate is secured, people will forget she ever mattered." Evelyn stepped away before they could discover her. She walked through the dark corridor without making a sound. For the first time in her life, she understood that the danger around her was not simply cruelty. It was planning. The following morning, she behaved exactly as she always had. She drank tea at breakfast. She answered polite questions. She thanked Lady Corisande for a new pair of gloves, but inside, something had changed. It was the first time in her life she had stopped waiting for someone else to protect her. She began searching quietly, not with anger, with patience. She remembered that her mother had once kept important documents inside a small wooden box with a brass lock. After Marianne's death, the box had vanished from Evelyn's room. For years, she had assumed it had been misplaced. Now she wondered whether it had been taken. The clue appeared through someone no one in the family considered important. Mrs. Bell, the old housekeeper, had served Ashcombe for more than 30 years. She rarely spoke, unless necessary. She understood that servants survived by knowing when silence was safer than honesty. But one evening, as Evelyn entered the servants' passage to speak with the cook about supplies for a tenant family, Mrs. Bell quietly placed a folded piece of paper into her hand. "Do not open it here," she whispered. Evelyn looked at her. "Why are you helping me?" The old housekeeper looked toward the grand staircase. "Because your mother once helped my son when no one else would." Then she lowered her voice. "And because some things hidden in this house should never have been hidden." That night, in the small room where Evelyn slept, she unfolded the paper. It was only a fragment, a few lines, a reference to a locked box, a solicitor's name, and a sentence written in her mother's handwriting. "If anything happens to me, Evelyn must know the truth." She read the words again and again. The paper did not explain everything. It did not give her victory. It did not suddenly change her position, but it gave her something far more dangerous. A reason to stop believing she was powerless. The next weeks became a careful performance. Evelyn smiled when expected. She attended meals. She walked through the estate as though nothing had changed. Meanwhile, she watched. She studied. She waited. And she began to understand that Lady Corisande was not merely trying to remove her from society, she was trying to remove her from history. The final blow came when Evelyn received another invitation to a winter ball. For one brief moment, she thought perhaps things had changed. Then she discovered that her name had been added only because Lady Corisande wanted the humiliation to happen publicly. She was not invited as a guest. She was invited as a warning. And when Evelyn entered that ballroom and heard the laughter of people who once called her family, she realized the next step would not be avoiding disgrace. It would be surviving it. Because behind the locked doors of Ashcombe Manor, there was still one piece of evidence that Lady Corisande had failed to find, and Evelyn was about to discover where it had been hidden. The place where the evidence had been hidden was not among the grand rooms that guests admired. It was beneath them. For years, Evelyn had walked past the old servants' corridor near the western side of Ashcombe Manor without giving it much thought. It was narrower than the public halls, with worn wooden boards and walls that had not been decorated in generations. To the family, it was invisible. To the servants, it was where the house remembered everything. Mrs. Bell waited there after midnight, carrying a small candle protected by her hand from the draught. "You must understand, Miss Evelyn," she whispered. "This was not something your mother intended to hide forever. She intended to reveal it when the time was right." Evelyn looked at the old housekeeper. And why did she never reveal it? Mrs. Bell lowered her eyes. Because she never received the chance. The words settled between them, not like an accusation, like a wound finally being named. Mrs. Bell led Evelyn to a small storage room that had once belonged to the previous house steward. Dust covered the shelves. Old account books rested beneath faded cloth. Broken furniture had been pushed against the walls. No one searched here anymore. That was why it had survived. The old housekeeper reached behind a loose section of wooden paneling and removed a small brass key. Evelyn stared at it. "Where did you find that?" Mrs. Bell hesitated. "Your mother gave it to me 3 days before she passed away." The answer struck Evelyn harder than she expected. For years, she had believed that her mother's death had taken everything with it. Her memories, her protection, her voice. But now, standing in the cold, hidden room of Ashcombe Manor, Evelyn realized Marianne had not disappeared completely. She had left a path. The key opened a small compartment, inside an old writing desk that had been stored beneath a torn covering. Inside was not a fortune, not jewels, not anything that could instantly restore Evelyn's position. There were only papers, a collection of carefully folded documents tied together with a faded ribbon. The first was a record of household accounts. The second was a letter from a solicitor. The third was a copy of a document bearing her father's signature. Evelyn read slowly. Then she stopped. Her mother's personal trust had not vanished after her death. It had been transferred. But not to Evelyn. The funds had been placed under the supervision of Earl Edmund Ashcombe until Evelyn reached a suitable age. And beside the account was a later note, a note showing that the arrangement had been altered after Corisande entered the household. Evelyn's hands trembled slightly. Not from fear, from understanding. The problem had never been that she had no claim. The problem was that someone had spent years making sure she never discovered she had one. She looked at Mrs. Bell. "Does my father know?" The old housekeeper did not answer immediately. That silence told Evelyn more than words could have. "He knows enough," she finally said. The candle flame moved between them. He may not know every detail, but he knew there were questions. He chose not to ask them. Evelyn closed her eyes for a moment. That was the truth she had struggled against for years. Lady Corisande had harmed her, but her father had allowed it. Not through cruelty, through weakness. And sometimes, weakness could destroy just as much as cruelty. The next morning, Evelyn returned to breakfast as though nothing had happened. Lady Corisande sat at the head of the table, speaking about the upcoming social season. She wore a calm expression, the expression of someone who believed the future already belonged to her. "I trust you enjoyed the ball," she said. Evelyn lifted her cup. "It was memorable." Lady Corisande smiled. "I imagine it was difficult." It was. The Countess waited for embarrassment. Instead, Evelyn looked directly at her. But difficulty has a way of revealing what comfort allows people to ignore. For the first time, Lady Corisande's expression changed. Only slightly, a brief tightening around the eyes. But Evelyn saw it. And she understood something important. The woman who had controlled every room for years had not expected resistance. Not from her. Not from the daughter she considered powerless. Later that afternoon, Evelyn made another discovery. A letter had arrived from London. It was from a solicitor Mrs. Bell had once trusted, a man who had handled some of Marianne's affairs before being dismissed by the new countess. He had agreed to meet, not at Ashcombe Manor. In London, the journey itself would be dangerous. Leaving the estate without explanation would create questions. Asking too many questions would create suspicion. So Evelyn did what she had learned to do. She waited. She planned. She observed. The first time in her life, she was no longer simply reacting to what others decided for her. She was choosing her own movements. Before leaving, she visited the village market under the excuse of purchasing supplies for a tenant family. There, away from polished floors and judgmental whispers, she saw a different world. Women who worked, women who traded, women who measured their worth by what they created, rather than by whether society invited them into a ballroom. She spoke with a seamstress who managed her own small business. She watched a widow count coins earned through honest work. And for the first time in her life, Evelyn understood that survival did not always come from remaining inside the walls that excluded her. Sometimes it came from building a door of her own. It was the first time in her life she considered that losing a place at someone else's table might not mean losing her place in the world. But when Evelyn returned to Ashcombe Manor that evening, she found something waiting in her room. The wooden box containing her mother's papers was open. The documents inside had been disturbed. Someone had searched through them, and on the table beside the box was a single message written in an unfamiliar hand. "Stop searching for things that were never meant to belong to you." Evelyn read the sentence twice. Then she folded the paper carefully. She did not tear it. She did not burn it. She placed it beside her mother's documents, because now she knew something Lady Corisande did not. Fear only worked when the person being threatened still believed they had something to lose. And Evelyn Ashcombe was beginning to understand that she had already lost the thing her enemies valued most, their permission. The following morning, Evelyn did not leave Ashcombe Manor immediately. She knew better than to move like someone frightened. Lady Corisande had spent years studying weakness. A sudden escape would only confirm that her suspicions were correct. A woman who appeared defeated was rarely watched closely. A woman who appeared calm was far more dangerous. So Evelyn continued with her usual duties. She walked through the gardens despite the cold. She reviewed household requests. She spoke politely to servants, who avoided meeting her eyes after the ballroom incident. But beneath that quiet appearance, every detail had changed. The house no longer felt like a prison. It felt like a place filled with evidence. Every corridor held a memory. Every locked door suggested a question. Every person who lowered their voice might have been carrying a piece of the truth. That afternoon, she found her father alone in his study. For years, Evelyn had avoided entering that room without invitation. It had always represented authority. Decisions were made there. Estates were managed there. Futures were written there. Now she stepped inside. Earl Edmund looked up from his papers. For a moment, he seemed surprised. Then tired. "Evelyn," he said quietly, "is something wrong?" She placed the damaged note from her room on the desk. His expression changed, only for a moment, but it was enough. "You know what this means," she said. Her father looked away. "I know that your stepmother can be difficult." Difficult. The word almost made Evelyn laugh. Not because it was amusing, because it was too small. She had spent years being dismissed with careful words. Difficult. Sensitive. Emotional. Unprepared. Words that made suffering sound like a personal flaw instead of something done to her. "This is not about Lady Corisande being difficult," Evelyn said. "This is about my mother's papers being taken. This is about my trust being altered. This is about people deciding I should know nothing about my own life." The Earl remained silent, and again, that silence answered her. "You knew," she whispered. Her father closed his eyes. "I suspected." The room became still. "I suspected there were disagreements regarding the accounts. I suspected Corisande handled matters more aggressively than she should have." Evelyn looked at him, "And you did nothing." His shoulders lowered. A lesser person would have argued. A lesser person would have blamed circumstances. but Edmund Ashcombe simply sat there with the weight of his own choices. I believed avoiding scandal would protect the family name. Evelyn felt something break inside her, not her heart, something older. Something she had carried since childhood, the hope that her father's silence came from ignorance. Now she knew it had come from choice. The family name was not protected by ignoring injustice, she said. It is only hidden. Her father looked at her then, and for the first time in many years, Evelyn saw regret. Not enough to repair everything, but enough to prove that he finally understood. Before he could answer, footsteps sounded outside the door. The handle moved. Lady Corisande entered without waiting. Her eyes moved from Edmund to Evelyn. "So this is where we have reached," she said. Her voice was calm, too calm. "A family discussion without me." Evelyn turned toward her. "It is not a discussion about you." Lady Corisande smiled. "Everything in this house is about me eventually." The confidence in those words revealed more than anger would have. She believed she owned the future, the estate, the reputation, the story itself. "Then perhaps that is the problem," Evelyn replied. For a moment, no one spoke. It was not a dramatic declaration. It was not a challenge shouted across the room. It was simply the first time Evelyn had spoken to her stepmother as an equal, and Lady Corisande noticed. "You have become bold," she said. "No," Evelyn answered. "I have become aware." The Countess stepped closer. "Be careful. Awareness can be mistaken for arrogance, and silence can be mistaken for obedience." The words landed heavily. Even Edmund looked at his daughter differently, because he understood then that Evelyn was no longer asking to be saved. She was preparing to save herself. That evening, Evelyn packed a small case. Not because she was fleeing, because she was beginning a journey. She carried only what she truly needed. A few dresses, her mother's papers, a notebook, and a small amount of money she had saved from managing household purchases over the years. The next morning before sunrise, she left for London. The carriage wheels moved over the wet country roads while Ashcombe Manor disappeared behind the mist. She looked back once. The house appeared exactly as it always had, large, beautiful, unforgiving. But Evelyn no longer saw it as the center of her existence. She saw it as the place where she had learned what she would never accept again. London greeted her differently. The city was louder than the countryside. The streets were crowded with merchants, workers, carriages, and people trying to build lives that did not depend on inherited names. For the first time, Evelyn walked among strangers who did not know she was the daughter of an earl. They did not care. They judged what she did, not what family she belonged to. She stayed at a modest lodging house near a busy market district. The room was small. The bed was narrow. The fire was weaker than the one she had known at Ashcombe. Yet that first evening, sitting beside the small fireplace, Evelyn felt something unexpected. Peace. It was not comfort. It was not luxury. It was freedom. The next day, she met Mr. Thomas Harrow, the solicitor who had once worked with her mother. He was older now, with silver hair and careful eyes. When he saw Evelyn, he immediately understood why she had come. "Your mother always worried this day might arrive," he said. Evelyn sat forward. She expected it. Mr. Harrow opened a drawer and removed a folder. Inside were copies of letters, letters that had never reached Evelyn, letters from relatives, letters from business partners, letters from people who had tried to contact her after her mother's death. Someone had intercepted them. Someone had made sure Evelyn believed she had been forgotten. But the final document was the one that mattered most. A detailed record showing that her mother had placed part of her personal inheritance into a protected account intended for Evelyn's future independence. Not marriage. Not convenience. Independence. "Your mother knew the world would expect you to depend on someone else," Mr. Harrow said. "She wanted you to have the ability to choose." Evelyn touched the paper gently. The first time in her life, she saw proof that someone had believed she deserved a choice. But Mr. Harrow was not finished. "There is something else." His expression became serious. "The changes made after your mother's death were not random. Someone was moving money. Someone was preparing for the possibility that your father's health would decline." Evelyn looked up. "Lady Corisande?" Mr. Harrow did not answer immediately. Because the truth was more complicated. The Countess was involved, but she was not acting alone, and somewhere inside Ashcombe Manor, another person had helped her. A person Evelyn had trusted. The words remained between Evelyn and Mr. Harrow. A person she had trusted. For several moments, she said nothing, because there were many names that could fit those words. Her father, a servant, a family advisor, someone who had smiled at breakfast while quietly helping to remove her from the life she had known. Who? Mr. Harrow looked toward the window. The rain had begun again, turning the London streets into dark reflections of gas lamps and passing carriages. I cannot accuse someone without proof, he said. But I can tell you what I found. He opened another folder. Inside were copies of household records from Ashcombe Manor. They were not the original accounts, but enough remained to reveal a pattern. Payments made, payments returned, signatures that appeared different depending on the document, and one name appearing more often than Evelyn expected. Mr. Harcourt, the family solicitor who had advised her father. Evelyn remembered the voice from the library. The conversation behind the half-open door. If the arrangements are completed, she will have no reason to question anything. She had never seen his face clearly that night. But now she understood. The danger had never been only Lady Corisande. She had not acted alone. Mr. Harrow folded his hands. Mr. Harcourt had been connected to your father's affairs for many years. He knew where every document was kept. He knew which questions your father would avoid. Evelyn looked down at the papers. Then he helped her. He did not need to answer. His silence was enough. The betrayal felt different from Lady Corisande's cruelty. Cruelty from an enemy could be expected. Betrayal from someone trusted was quieter. It entered through a door that had always been left open. That evening, Evelyn returned to her lodging house carrying copies of the documents. The room was still small. The fire still struggled against the cold, but she no longer felt like a woman who had been pushed aside. She felt like someone gathering pieces of a broken story. Over the next several days, Evelyn began building something she had never imagined before. A life independent of Ashcombe. She could not immediately reclaim her position. She could not walk back into Valancrest's ballroom and demand that society apologize. She knew the world did not work that way. A woman without proof was often treated as a woman without a voice. So she chose another path. She began working. At first it was simple. She helped a widow who owned a small dressmaking business near the market district. Evelyn had always understood fabrics, household management, and careful accounts. Skills that had been dismissed as ordinary inside a noble household became valuable outside it. The widow, Mrs. Eleanor Whitby, did not ask about titles. She asked whether Evelyn could keep accurate records. Evelyn could. She asked whether Evelyn could speak with suppliers without being intimidated. Evelyn could. She asked whether Evelyn was willing to work. Evelyn was. The first week was exhausting. Her hands became sore from writing for hours. Her clothes no longer matched the fashionable women she had once stood beside at grand gatherings. Her name opened no doors. But each evening, when she counted the small earnings she had received through honest work, she felt something she had never felt inside Ashcombe Manor. Ownership. It was the first time in her life she earned something that belonged entirely to her, not inherited, not granted, not controlled by another person. Created. While Evelyn was building this new existence, Lady Corisande was growing impatient. Back at Ashcombe Manor, the Countess discovered that Evelyn had not disappeared as expected. She had expected shame to make the young woman retreat. Instead, silence had been replaced by action. The Countess confronted Earl Edmund in the library. "You allowed her to leave." The Earl looked at the papers before him. "I allowed my daughter to seek answers." Lady Corisande's expression hardened. "Answers are dangerous things." "Only when people know the truth," Edmund replied. For the first time, Corisande looked uncertain, not afraid, but aware, because she knew something had changed. The daughter she had dismissed was no longer waiting for approval. A week later, another letter arrived at Evelyn's lodging house. It carried no family seal, no polite greeting, only a message. "Come to the church hall near Ashcombe village if you wish to know what happened to your mother's final instructions." Evelyn read it carefully. She recognized the handwriting. Mrs. Bell. The old housekeeper had risked sending it. But there was something unusual. The letter mentioned a meeting place. Not Ashcombe Manor, not London. A neutral place. A place where servants, villagers, and members of the family could exist on equal ground. Evelyn knew it could be a trap. She knew Lady Corisande might already understand what she was doing. But she also knew that some truths could never be found by remaining hidden. So she prepared to return. Not as the girl who had left Ashcombe Manor after being humiliated. Not as the daughter waiting for her father to defend her. She would return as someone who had learned the value of her own judgment. When the carriage carried her back toward the cold hills and familiar stone walls, Evelyn looked at the road ahead. The house that once represented everything she could lose was waiting. But this time, she was not returning to ask whether she belonged. She was returning to discover who had tried to make her believe she did not. The church hall stood at the edge of the village, far from the polished rooms where Evelyn had once been judged. It was a simple building. There were no chandeliers, no painted ceilings, no rows of guests waiting to decide a person's worth. Only wooden benches, a small fire struggling in the corner, and the quiet sound of rain against the windows. Evelyn entered just before dusk. For a moment, she wondered if no one would come. Then she saw Mrs. Bell standing near the back wall. The old housekeeper looked older than she had a few weeks earlier, not because of age, because carrying the truth for too long had a weight of its own. Miss Evelyn. The way Mrs. Bell said her name almost brought back the girl she had been. The girl who had believed the walls of Ashcombe Manor would always protect her, but Evelyn was no longer that girl. Mrs. Bell reached into her coat and removed a small envelope. Your mother wanted this given to you, if the circumstances became dangerous. Evelyn looked at the envelope. Why now? The old woman glanced toward the doorway. Because now they know you are searching. Before Evelyn could answer, another figure entered the hall. Mr. Harcourt. The solicitor stopped when he saw them. For a brief moment, his confidence disappeared. Then it returned. Miss Ashcombe, he said. Evelyn felt the anger rise, not the kind that caused reckless decisions, a colder kind. The kind born from understanding. You knew, she said. Mr. Harcourt remained silent. You knew about my mother's papers. You knew about the trust. You knew about the letters. The solicitor adjusted his gloves. I knew there were matters best handled carefully. Carefully, the word echoed. Evelyn stepped closer. You mean quietly? His expression hardened. You do not understand the responsibilities involved. Your father's position required difficult choices. No. Evelyn looked directly at him. His position required difficult choices. You chose convenient ones. The room became still. Even Mrs. Bell stopped moving. Mr. Harcourt had expected anger. He had expected pleading. He had not expected judgment. Evelyn opened her mother's envelope. Inside was a letter. The handwriting was familiar, the same careful writing that had survived years of silence. My dearest Evelyn, if you are reading this, then someone has attempted to convince you that you are less important than you are. Do not believe them. The letter continued. Her mother had written about the trust, about the changes made after her death, about her concern that certain people would confuse Evelyn's kindness with weakness. But the final lines were the ones that made Evelyn stop. A person who knows their own worth cannot be easily controlled. She lowered the paper. For the first time since returning to Ashcombe, she felt something stronger than sadness. Certainty. Mr. Harcourt saw the change in her face, and he understood. The documents were no longer hidden. The story was no longer only his to shape. You think this changes everything? He asked. Evelyn folded the letter carefully. No, it changes me. That answer unsettled him more than any accusation could have, because a person who had found their own strength was much harder to manipulate. Later that evening, Evelyn returned to Ashcombe Manor, not through the servants' entrance, not through a hidden path, through the main doors, the same doors she had been forced to leave behind. The servants watched silently. Some looked surprised, some looked relieved. Mrs. Bell followed behind her. Word had already begun moving through the household. The truth had started where it always started, not in the grand rooms, in the kitchens, in the corridors, among the people who saw everything and were expected to say nothing. When Evelyn entered the entrance hall, Lady Corisande was waiting. The Countess looked at her with disbelief. "You returned." Evelyn removed her gloves. "Yes, I did." Lady Corisande studied her. "You should have stayed in London, perhaps. But I needed to see this house again." The Countess smiled faintly. "And what do you see?" Evelyn looked around. She saw the staircase where she had walked as a child, the corridor where she had overheard the truth, the rooms where decisions had been made without her. Then she looked back at Corisande. "I see a place where people believed silence would last forever." For once, Lady Corisande had no immediate reply. Because the greatest threat was no longer the papers Evelyn carried. It was the fact that she no longer needed permission to speak. But beneath the calm exchange, another discovery was waiting. A final record in Mr. Harcourt's accounts, a payment, a signature, and a connection that would reveal why Lady Corisande had needed control of Ashcombe Manor more desperately than anyone had imagined. The final record was not hidden in the grand rooms of Ashcombe Manor. It was hidden where Lady Corisande believed no one would look, among ordinary expenses, among small payments, among numbers that appeared too insignificant to attract attention. That was why Evelyn spent the following morning in the old accounting room with the ledgers spread before her. The room had once belonged to her father's steward. It was rarely used now. Dust covered the shelves, and the smell of old paper filled the air. Mrs. Bell stood nearby. "I always wondered why your mother spent so many afternoons here," the housekeeper said. Evelyn looked at the open books. She was not searching for a dramatic confession. She was searching for a pattern, and patterns were where careless people revealed themselves. She compared the household accounts with the documents Mr. Harrow had provided. At first, nothing appeared unusual. Then she noticed the same name, a supplier, a payment, a signature, repeated, always just below the amount that would have required additional review. It was clever. Not because it was impossible to discover, because it was designed to look ordinary. Evelyn traced the entries with her finger. Mr. Harcourt was not simply helping Lady Corisande control the estate. He was being paid by her. Mrs. Bell moved closer. "Are you certain?" Evelyn nodded. The money came from Ashcombe accounts, but it did not serve Ashcombe. The discovery should have brought satisfaction. Instead, Evelyn felt something colder, because she finally understood the scale of what had happened. This had not been one cruel decision. It had been years of small choices, a letter hidden, a signature altered, a question ignored, a person dismissed. The destruction of a person's place in a family rarely happened in one moment. It happened quietly, piece by piece. That afternoon, Evelyn requested a meeting with her father. The Earl was in the library when she entered. This time, she did not wait at the door. She walked inside. "I have found the reason." Edmund looked up. His face changed before she even explained. That told her he already feared what she would say. She placed the account pages on the desk. "Your solicitor was receiving money from household funds." The Earl stared at the papers. For several moments, he said nothing. Then he whispered, "I trusted him." Evelyn looked at him, and there it was, the same mistake that had allowed everything else to happen. Trust without questions. Kindness without attention. Silence disguised as patience. "Father," she said quietly, "trust is not the same as refusing to see." Edmund looked away. The words hurt because they were true. He had spent years believing that avoiding conflict would preserve peace. But peace built on hidden suffering was only another form of injustice. Before he could respond, the library door opened. Lady Corisande entered. This time, she did not appear amused. She had heard enough. "You have been searching through private family matters." Evelyn turned. "I have been searching through matters that affected my life." The Countess stepped forward. "You are making a dangerous mistake." "No." Evelyn remained calm. "I made a mistake before. I believed that because people had titles, they also had integrity." The words struck harder than an accusation. Lady Corisande's face tightened. "You think you can return after a few weeks in London and challenge everyone here?" Evelyn looked at her. "I did not return with power. I returned with proof." The silence that followed was different from the silence in the ballroom. That night, no one laughed. No one whispered behind a fan. because everyone in the room understood that something had shifted. Lady Corisande left without another word. But Evelyn knew she would not surrender easily. People who built their lives on control rarely accepted losing it gracefully. The next day, Evelyn received an unexpected visitor. The Duke of Ravenshade. He was a distant relative of the family, and one of the few people whose reputation carried enough weight to challenge the situation openly. He had attended the winter ball. He had seen Evelyn standing alone. He had heard the laughter. But he had said nothing then. That fact mattered to Evelyn, because she had learned not to mistake late support for immediate courage. The Duke removed his gloves. "Miss Ashcombe," he said, "I owe you an apology." Evelyn studied him. For what? For witnessing an injustice and choosing silence. The honesty surprised her. Most people apologized only when they wanted forgiveness. The Duke seemed to be apologizing because he finally understood. "I cannot undo what happened in that ballroom," he continued, "but I can help ensure the truth is heard." Evelyn remained cautious. Help is valuable. But truth must not depend on someone powerful deciding to believe it. The Duke nodded. "Then, let the truth stand without me." That answer changed something. Not completely, not suddenly, but enough. For the first time, Evelyn saw that not every person of rank used their position to protect themselves. Some could use it to open doors for others. Still, the greatest confrontation had not yet arrived, because Lady Corisande had one final move. A formal gathering was announced at Valancrest. The same ballroom, the same society, the same people who had watched Evelyn be humiliated. This time, however, the gathering was not intended to mock her. It was intended to prove that she was unstable. Lady Corisande planned to tell the guests that Evelyn had become obsessed with old papers and false accusations after leaving Ashcombe. She would use the very thing that had nearly destroyed other women before: doubt, reputation, the suggestion that a woman's voice could not be trusted. Evelyn learned of the plan through a servant who had overheard the conversation near the half-open library door, the second time such a message had reached her that way, and the last, because now she understood. The enemy's greatest weakness was not cruelty. It was believing everyone else was still afraid. As the carriage prepared to take Evelyn to Valancrest, she looked at the documents beside her. The papers were not weapons. They were not revenge. They were simply the truth waiting to be heard. And for the first time since she had been left alone in that ballroom, Evelyn was not walking toward judgment. She was walking toward the moment when everyone else would finally have to face it. The carriage moved through the winter roads toward Valancrest, carrying Evelyn back to the place where her humiliation had begun. The sky was grey. The rain fell steadily. But this time, the cold outside the carriage did not feel like punishment. It felt like a reminder. She remembered another journey. The night she had left the ballroom with everyone's laughter following behind her. The night she had believed that losing society's approval meant losing her future. Now she understood the difference. They had taken her place in their rooms. They had taken her invitations. They had taken her confidence. But they had never taken the truth. And truth, once uncovered, was much harder to silence. When the carriage arrived at Valancrest, the entrance hall was already filled with guests. The same families, the same names, the same people who had watched without speaking. For a moment, Evelyn saw the ballroom exactly as it had been. The polished floor, the bright lights, the careful smiles. Then she noticed something different. The room was no longer looking down at her. It was waiting. Lady Corisande stood near the center of the gathering, dressed perfectly, surrounded by those who still believed her version of events. She smiled when Evelyn entered. "Miss Ashcombe," her voice carried enough for everyone nearby to hear. "How unexpected." Evelyn removed her gloves slowly. "I imagine it is." The Countess studied her. "After leaving for London, I feared you had become overwhelmed by unfortunate ideas." There it was. The accusation hidden inside concern. The suggestion that Evelyn was not a woman seeking justice, only a woman unable to accept reality. Several guests exchanged glances. Evelyn recognized the strategy immediately. Not evidence, not facts. A question planted in people's minds. Could she be mistaken? Could she be unstable? Could a woman truly understand financial matters? It was the same weapon used against countless women who dared challenge those with power. Lady Corisande turned toward the guests. We all care for Evelyn. That is why I believe compassion is necessary. Evelyn almost admired the performance. Almost. Because years earlier, those words might have confused her. Now they only revealed the plan. Compassion was being used as a disguise for control. Before Lady Corisande could continue, another voice interrupted. I believe Miss Ashcombe deserves to speak for herself. The room turned. The Duke of Ravenshade stood near the doorway. But he was not the first to step forward. Behind him stood Mrs. Bell, and beside her was another figure, Mr. Harrow. The Countess's expression changed, only slightly, but Evelyn saw it. The first sign that confidence was beginning to weaken. The Duke did not raise his voice. He did not need to. This gathering was arranged to discuss Miss Ashcombe's judgment. It seems reasonable that her evidence should be heard before anyone questions her character. Lady Corisande smiled politely. Your Grace, this is a family matter. No, the Duke replied. It concerns inheritance, financial records, and a woman's reputation. That makes it a matter of public responsibility. The room became silent. Not the uncomfortable silence of the ballroom, a different kind. A silence where people were forced to listen. Mr. Harrow stepped forward. I have reviewed the documents connected to Lady Marianne Ashcombe's trust. The Countess immediately turned. You are not involved in this family. Mr. Harrow looked at her calmly. I was involved when the original arrangements were made, and I remained involved when they were altered without proper explanation. A murmur moved through the guests. Lady Corisande's composure slipped, only briefly, but enough. Evelyn watched carefully. She had expected anger. She had expected denial. Instead, the Countess did something more revealing. She looked toward Mr. Harcourt. A single glance, a request, a warning. Everyone saw it, and that was the beginning of the end. Because a person can deny words, a person can deny documents, but a person cannot always deny instinct. Mr. Harcourt stepped forward. This situation has been exaggerated. Evelyn looked at him. Then prove it. The solicitor stopped. The simplicity of the challenge unsettled him. Not because it was difficult, because it was fair. Evelyn opened the folder she carried. The room watched as she placed the documents on the table. No dramatic gesture. No accusation. Only evidence. These records show payments made from Ashcombe funds to accounts connected with Mr. Harcourt. These letters show messages that were intercepted before reaching me. These documents show changes made to my mother's trust after her death. Lady Corisande looked around the room. You expect them to believe you because you found old papers. Evelyn met her gaze. No, I expect them to read them. That was the difference. She was not asking for sympathy. She was asking for judgment based on facts. Mr. Harcourt reached for one of the documents, then stopped. Because he knew. The papers were already in front of everyone. The truth was no longer locked in a desk, no longer hidden behind a servant's silence, no longer trapped inside a daughter's unanswered questions. The Duke looked toward the guests. There was a time when many of us saw Miss Ashcombe standing alone in this very room. Some of us laughed. Some of us remained silent. The Duke paused. Silence can also become a choice. The words affected the room more than anger would have, because many present had to confront their own actions. Not everyone had helped the injustice, but too many had accepted it. Lady Corisande's final attempt came quietly. She stepped toward Evelyn. You will destroy this family. Evelyn looked at her. No, I am revealing what was done in its name. For the first time, Lady Corisande had no answer, because the person she had tried to erase was standing before the same society that had once rejected her. And this time, they were not watching a woman lose her place. They were watching her take it back. For several moments, no one moved. The room that had once been filled with whispers now held something far more uncomfortable. Reflection. The guests who had laughed at Evelyn's loneliness now looked away from her, not because they disliked her, but because they remembered. They remembered the ballroom. They remembered Lady Corisande's words. They remembered how easy it had been to accept a story when it benefited them to believe it. Mr. Harcourt was the first to break. These documents prove nothing beyond confusion, he said. but his voice lacked the certainty it once carried. Evelyn noticed. So did everyone else. Mr. Harrow stepped beside the table. Then perhaps you would explain the confusion. He placed another document beside the others. A copy of a payment record, then another, and another. Each one connected the missing funds, the altered instructions, and the private payments made under false household expenses. The Countess looked at the papers, then at Mr. Harcourt. For the first time, the partnership between them was no longer hidden. "You assured me this would never happen," she said quietly. The words were barely above a whisper, but the room heard them, and that was enough. Mr. Harcourt's face changed. He realized too late that Lady Corisande had just revealed the very connection she had spent years concealing. Evelyn watched them carefully. She had imagined this moment many times. She had imagined anger. She had imagined satisfaction. But standing there, beneath the same lights where she had once been humiliated, she felt something else, a strange sadness. Not for them, for the years that had been wasted, for all the conversations that could have been honest, for all the pain that had been unnecessary. Lady Corisande turned back toward the room. "You cannot understand what I was trying to protect." Her words were no longer powerful. They sounded like an explanation given after the decision had already been made. The family name, the estate, the future. Evelyn looked at her. "Those things mattered to you, but not the people who carried them." The Countess said nothing, because that was the truth she could not reshape. A servant who had stood near the doorway stepped forward. It was Thomas, one of the older footmen who had served Ashcombe for many years. Everyone looked surprised. Servants were expected to observe, not speak. But Thomas removed his gloves and held them in his hands. "I apologize for interrupting, my lords and ladies." The Duke nodded. "Speak." Thomas looked toward Evelyn. Miss Ashcombe was kind to this household long before anyone thought she had power. She visited the tenants. She remembered the names of children who worked on the estate. She asked about families no one else noticed. He swallowed. I remained silent because I feared losing my position. The admission was quiet, but it carried weight. Then he looked toward Lady Corisande. But silence allowed things to continue. Evelyn lowered her eyes for a moment, because she understood. The truth had not been hidden only by those who created the injustice. It had survived because others had been afraid to reveal it. The Duke stepped forward. "Mr. Harcourt, until this matter is properly reviewed, you will provide access to all remaining records connected with Ashcombe affairs." The solicitor's face turned pale. "And Lady Corisande?" The Duke's expression remained formal. "The invitations and social privileges you have relied upon will naturally be reconsidered by those who extended them." It was not a punishment of cruelty. It was something far more fitting, a loss of the very reputation she had protected above everything else. The doors that had once opened for Lady Corisande began to close. Not with anger, with absence. The conversations that once welcomed her would become shorter. The invitations would become fewer. The society that had helped her maintain an illusion would no longer support it. Evelyn looked around the ballroom. The same place. A different ending. Later that evening, after most guests had departed, she found herself alone in the garden outside Valancrest. The winter air was cold. The branches were bare, but for the first time, the cold did not feel like rejection. It simply felt like winter. The Duke joined her a short while later. "I hope you know what you accomplished tonight." Evelyn looked toward the house. "I did not come here to defeat anyone." He considered her answer. "No. You came here so no one else could decide your story for you." She smiled faintly. That was closer. The garden remained quiet, the only place where no one demanded a performance. No title, no reputation, no explanation, just two people speaking honestly. Evelyn knew the events of that night would be discussed throughout the county. Some would praise her, some would criticize her, some would claim she had been fortunate. But she knew the truth. Her victory had not begun in the ballroom. It had begun in the moment she stopped waiting for someone else to recognize her worth. And while Valancrest slowly learned to remember her name differently, Evelyn still had one final decision to make: whether she would return to the life she had lost, or build one that had always belonged to her. Evelyn did not make her decision that night. For many years, others had decided things for her. They had decided where she belonged. They had decided what she could inherit. They had decided whether her voice carried enough importance to be heard. She would not allow another person to decide what came next. The following weeks brought changes that moved quietly through the county. There were no dramatic announcements in the newspapers, no public declarations meant to create spectacle. Instead, the changes arrived in small ways. A letter that was no longer answered, an invitation that never came, a conversation that ended when Lady Corisande entered the room. The same society that had once protected appearances began protecting itself from association with scandal, and Lady Corisande discovered something she had never considered. Reputation was not a possession, it was a trust, and once broken, it could not always be restored. Mr. Harcourt left Ashcombe after further questions were raised regarding the accounts. He did not face the kind of punishment people in the ballroom had once imagined for others they disliked. There was no dramatic downfall. Only the loss of confidence, the loss of clients, the loss of the respect he had built his entire career upon. For a man who valued appearances above all else, it was a consequence he understood completely. Earl Edmund, meanwhile, spent many days in the library where so many decisions had been made without Evelyn. He began reviewing the estate records himself, not because Evelyn demanded it, because he finally understood that responsibility could not be handed away simply because the truth was uncomfortable. One afternoon, he asked Evelyn to walk with him through the gardens. The winter frost had begun to disappear. Small signs of spring appeared beneath the hedges and along the stone paths. For years, this garden had been the only place in Ashcombe where Evelyn had felt she could breathe. Her father stopped near the old rose bushes. "I owe you an apology." Evelyn looked at him. She had waited for those words once. When she was younger, she had imagined that hearing them would erase everything. Now she knew better. An apology could acknowledge the wound. It could not remove the years spent carrying it. "You do," she said quietly. Edmund looked down. "I believed I was protecting the family." "You were protecting its appearance." The answer was painful, but he accepted it. "Yes." A long silence followed. Not an angry silence, a truthful one. Finally he said, "I do not expect you to forgive me quickly." Evelyn looked toward the garden. That was the first thing he had said that made her believe he might truly understand. Because forgiveness was not something owed, it was something earned. "I do not know what will happen between us," she replied, "but I know I no longer want a relationship built on pretending." Her father nodded, and for the first time, they stood together without the weight of a false story between them. Not healed, not completely, but honest. Months later, Evelyn made another choice. She did not return to Ashcombe as a dependent daughter waiting for protection. She returned with a purpose. With part of her mother's trust restored, she invested in a small enterprise connected to the village, a workshop that supported women who needed honest work and fair payment. Some people considered it unusual. Some considered it unsuitable for a woman of her background. Evelyn ignored both opinions, because she had learned something important in London. Work was not a sign that a person had fallen. It was proof that a person could rise. The first morning the workshop opened, Evelyn stood outside the small building and watched women arrive carrying baskets, tools, and bundles of fabric. There were no chandeliers, no expensive gowns, no guests waiting to judge them, only people creating something with their own hands. And Evelyn felt a quiet happiness she had never found inside the grandest rooms. It was not the happiness of being admired. It was the happiness of being useful. Later that season, Evelyn attended another ball at Valancrest. The invitation came not from Lady Corisande. It came from the household itself. She almost refused, not because she feared the room, but because she no longer needed it. Yet she decided to go, not to prove anything, not to seek approval, simply because she wanted to. When she entered the ballroom, conversations paused, but this time the silence was different. No one was waiting to see her fail. They were waiting because they remembered. The woman who had once stood alone had returned by choice. The Duke of Ravenshade crossed the room toward her. But he did not arrive as a rescuer. He arrived as someone who had watched her fight her own battles and respected her for it. "May I have this dance?" Evelyn looked across the room, at the floor where she had once been humiliated, at the doors she had once walked through, believing she was unwanted. Then she placed her hand in his. Yes. And as the music began, Evelyn understood that the greatest change had not been that society finally welcomed her. The greatest change was that she no longer needed society to decide whether she belonged. Years earlier, she had stood alone because others believed she had lost her value. Now she stood among them knowing they had never possessed the power to give it or take it away. Her mother had been right. A person who knew their own worth could not be easily controlled, and Evelyn Ashcombe had finally learned the truth her enemies had spent years trying to hide. Dignity was never something granted by a title. It was something carried within. If this story of courage, justice, and finding one's own worth touched your heart, please like, subscribe, and support the channel for more stories of forgotten voices finding their truth. The years that followed did not erase what had happened. They transformed it. Evelyn never forgot the night she had stood alone beneath the lights of Valancrest. She never forgot the laughter, the whispers, or the feeling of realizing that the people around her had already decided who she was before they truly knew her. But she also never forgot what came after. The quiet courage of Mrs. Bell, the honesty of Mr. Harrow. The moment her father finally chose truth over comfort, the realization that a person could lose a place in society and still find a place in the world. Ashcombe changed slowly, not into the perfect home it had once pretended to be, but into an honest one. The servants who had spent years lowering their voices began speaking more freely. The accounts were managed openly. The estate became known not only for its old name, but for the fairness shown to those who depended upon it. Lady Corisande remained away from the center of society. Some said she regretted what she had done. Others said she regretted only that she had been discovered. Evelyn never spent her life trying to decide which was true. She had learned that peace did not come from understanding every person who had caused harm. Sometimes peace came from no longer allowing them to control the direction of one's life. Her relationship with her father never returned to what it had been before her mother's death. It became something different, something more honest. They spoke less about the past and more about the present, and that, Evelyn realized, was its own kind of healing. As for the Duke of Ravenshade, he remained beside her not because she needed someone to rescue her, but because he admired the woman she had become. He had first noticed her because she stood alone. He stayed because she had proven she could stand without anyone beside her. Years later, visitors to the Ashcombe estate would sometimes ask about the woman whose story had once been whispered throughout the county. They expected to hear about scandal, about betrayal, about a noble family nearly destroyed by secrets. But those who truly knew Evelyn remembered something else. They remembered the young woman who walked away from humiliation without surrendering her dignity. They remembered the daughter who discovered that being rejected by a room did not mean being rejected by the world. They remembered the woman who learned that the strongest foundations were not built from titles, wealth, or approval. They were built from truth. One winter evening, Evelyn stood beside the window of the small workshop she had created and watched the lights of the village appear one by one against the darkening sky. The room was warm. The workers were laughing. The tables were filled with fabric, letters, and carefully written accounts. It was not the grandest room she had ever entered, but it was the first one that had truly belonged to her. And as the fire burned softly beside her, Evelyn remembered the words her mother had written years before. A person who knows their own worth cannot be easily controlled, because the greatest victory was never making those who doubted her finally approve of her. It was realizing she had never needed their approval at all. Dignity was not given, it was kept. If this story of courage, justice, and finding one's own worth touched your heart, please like, subscribe, and support the channel for more stories of forgotten voices finding their truth. The message had been repeated many times before, but this time it reached Evelyn differently, not as a farewell, as a reminder. Because stories did not truly end when the last words were spoken. They continued in the choices people made afterward. Several years after the events at Valancrest, a young woman arrived at the Ashcombe workshop, carrying a small bundle of worn clothing and a letter she could barely bring herself to show. She had been dismissed from a household after being accused of dishonesty. The accusation was enough to close every door. Evelyn recognized the fear in her eyes immediately. It was the same fear she had once carried into the ballroom. The fear of being believed guilty before being heard. Evelyn did not ask what society thought first. She asked what had happened. And when the young woman finished her story, Evelyn quietly placed the letter on the table. A person's reputation should not be decided by the loudest voice in the room, she said. The woman looked surprised, because years earlier, Evelyn herself would have needed someone to say those words. Now she was the person who could offer them. The workshop continued to grow. Not because it became famous, not because it gained the approval of every noble family in the county. It grew because people discovered that fairness was more valuable than appearance. The women who worked there learned accounting, negotiation, and skills that allowed them to support themselves. Evelyn kept careful records. She kept promises. She remembered what it felt like to have no one believe her, and she made certain others would not experience the same loneliness. One winter evening, Evelyn returned to Valancrest for a small gathering. The ballroom had changed. The same walls remained. The same windows looked out over the gardens. But the atmosphere was different. The room no longer carried the weight of a secret waiting to harm someone. It carried the quieter feeling of people who had learned from what happened there. An elderly guest approached Evelyn. Years before, that same woman had laughed behind her fan when Lady Corisande humiliated her. Now she stood with visible regret. "Miss Ashcombe," she said softly. "I have often thought about that evening." Evelyn waited. "I should have spoken." The apology was simple. It did not erase the past. It did not repair every wound. But it was honest. Evelyn nodded. Many people were silent that night. The woman lowered her eyes. "Yes." Evelyn looked around the ballroom. Then she answered, "But some learned not to remain silent forever, and that was enough." Later, standing near the garden doors, Evelyn watched the snow begin to fall. The garden had always been the one place where truth felt easier to speak. Her mother had loved that place. Her father had once walked there avoiding difficult conversations, and Evelyn had stood there learning that forgiveness and forgetting were not the same thing. She no longer carried anger like a burden. She carried memory like a lesson. The past had shaped her, but it did not own her. When the evening ended, Evelyn stepped outside into the cold air. The world around her was still imperfect. People still judged. Names still mattered. Power still tempted those who held it. But there were also people willing to listen, people willing to change, people willing to stand when silence would have been easier. And beneath the winter sky, Evelyn Ashcombe understood that the greatest victory was never that a room finally welcomed her. It was that she had learned to create rooms where others would always have a place. A quiet fire burned inside the Ashcombe workshop that night, warming the hands of women who had once believed they had nowhere to go. And the woman who had once sat alone at every ball became the woman who made sure no one else had to. The lesson Evelyn carried forward was not only remembered by those who had suffered quietly, it was also noticed by those who had once believed that nothing in their world needed to change. One spring morning, a letter arrived at Ashcombe Manor addressed to Evelyn. The handwriting was unfamiliar. Inside was a request from a distant estate where several women working in domestic service had been dismissed without proper payment after the death of their employer. The family involved had connections, a respected name, and enough influence to make the matter disappear if no one challenged them. Evelyn read the letter carefully. Years earlier, she might have wondered whether she had the right to interfere. She might have worried that powerful people would dislike her for asking difficult questions. Now she understood something different. A person did not gain a voice by being invited to use it. Sometimes a person gained a voice by deciding that silence had already cost too much. She traveled with the necessary documents, not as a noble woman seeking recognition, but as someone who understood how easily people without protection could be ignored. When she arrived, she found the same pattern she had once faced herself. Small decisions, quiet exclusions. People assuming that those with less power would never challenge them. But this time, the story changed before the damage became permanent. The women were heard. The accounts were reviewed. The truth was placed where everyone could see it. And when Evelyn returned to Ashcombe, she did not feel victorious because she had defeated another person. She felt grateful because the loneliness she had once known had become the reason she recognized loneliness in others. That evening, she walked through the garden where she had once spoken with her father about broken trust. The seasons had changed many times since then. The same paths remained. The same trees stood. But Evelyn was no longer the young woman searching for proof that she mattered. She had become the proof. She understood that justice was not always a grand moment beneath chandeliers. Sometimes it was a letter answered, a voice protected, a person believed before they were forced to prove their worth. The world had not become perfect. It never would. But one woman who had once been told she no longer belonged had created a place where others could begin again. And whenever winter returned to the hills around Ashcombe, the lights of the workshop continued to shine against the darkness, not as a symbol of wealth, not as a sign of status, but as a quiet reminder that even the smallest light could guide someone home. Because the woman who had once been abandoned by a room full of people had discovered the greatest truth of all. A person's worth was never decided by who welcomed them. It was revealed by what they chose to do when they were finally free.